Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheranism. We hear new stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. So whether you're a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you'll find what you're looking for right here. Today's guest is Dr. James Ambrose Lee II. He has earned his bachelor's at Concordia University in River Forest, Illinois, his master's of divinity from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, his systematic theology master's in liturgical theology from Yale Divinity School and Yale Institute of Sacred Music, New Haven, Connecticut, and his PhD in historical theology from St. Louis University, St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Lee currently teaches classes at Concordia University Chicago on various topics in church history, including Christianity in the modern world, women in the history of Christianity, and Martin Luther. He also teaches Encountering Religion in America and Introduction to Christianity. Today we'll discuss his research within a larger body of research on a topic of Wissenschaft, which we'll talk about today, but today's focus is on one man in particular, August Vilmar, and the German Theological Wissenschaft. He presented this research in an article that recently appeared in the Lutheran Quarterly. Dr. Lee, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So before we get too deep into the content of your article, can you give a definition of what German Wissenschaft means, not only for the people who don't know German, but also because the term itself is difficult to translate?
Yeah. The term that the English word that we most usually translate Wissenschaft with is science. And that's not a bad translation at all, but the word science is a loaded term, and it's come to mean different things in our day than it did in the 19th century, or even across different periods within the 19th century, let alone the 17th century and beyond. So perhaps in the 19th century, the focus of this essay, the term Wissenschaft really explodes in prominence within an academic environment. And there's a lot that can be said about Wissenschaft, but maybe I'll summarize it this way. The word Wissenschaft, or the concept of Wissenschaft, the concept of science, was undergoing a transformation already at the beginning of the 19th century. And then by the second half of the 19th century, we see a further transformation of the concept of what science or Wissenschaft was. And that's really painting in broad strokes, but that allows us to see that there were two large schools, if you will. Schools is even a misnomer, but two large kind of conceptions or definitions of Wissenschaft operating within the first half of the 19th century. The first one was indebted to German philosophical idealism, wherein Wissenschaft, or science, was largely conceived of as a knowledge that was related to the capital A absolute. And in fact, all knowledge emanated in some way or proceeded in some way from the absolute. Here we can think of figures as early Schelling, and even in a way Hegel as well. And those are kind of the main figures of this period of German idealism. And not to say that they are the same. One knows that Schelling and Hegel aren't. And for this school, or this way of thinking about Wissenschaft, there's this original unconditional knowledge. Some will call it a primordial knowledge that exists within the absolute. And then this knowledge is realized, becomes real as opposed to the ideal in a host of different ways. And as it becomes realized, this absolute knowledge is differentiated into distinct branches of knowledge. And therefore, a distinct science, a distinct Wissenschaft, investigates the relationship between one realized form of knowledge, and I'm not speaking here technically, but one realized area of knowledge, and then how it relates to the absolute. That there is a kind of unitive relationship between the knowledge as we have encountered it in the finite, in the realm of the real, and its relationship to the absolute. For someone like Schelling, all of these sciences are a part of an organic whole, and they all relate to one another by ultimately flowing back into the absolute. And for Schelling and Hegel and others, kind of the queen of the sciences in a certain sense is philosophy, because philosophy is a participation in many ways in the actual knowledge of the absolute. So that sounds very kind of esoteric and strange, but it was very prominent within the first 2, 3, 4 decades of the 19th century. But already by the 1830s, 1840s, we have a second idea of science that is developing. And this one will probably be much closer to what we consider a science in America. And this is a science that is conceived of in an empirical manner, often known as the Naturwissenschaft, or the nature sciences. And this was championed by a number of different men, but maybe some of our listeners would know names like Ludwig Buchner, Ernst Haeckel, Rudolf Virchow. And within this conception of science, these men and others differentiated themselves from any kind of idealistic understanding of science. And they rejected at the outset all philosophy and theological priors, or at least that's what they said they did, right? They said, we have no philosophical presuppositions. In fact, they rejected the idea that one begins with some type of unified knowledge of the whole and then moves to investigate the particular. They said it's the other way around. Science begins with the particular, and then by studying the particular, you can begin to maybe understand the nature of the whole. In place of an idealistic organicism, these empiricists promoted an understanding of reality that was strictly mechanistic rather than an organic, life-giving organism, and was also materialistic. So that's kind of what Wissenschaft meant in Germany in the 19th century. And the latter, the empiricist, materialistic understanding of Wissenschaft, came to win the day. And that's what you and I and most of our listeners, when they hear science, they probably think of empirical, natural investigation.
So, and you're kind of saying that you build up the whole from a particular. Could I just really put it into the layman's terms and say we're going to discover what is real through observation, and it's kind of like collecting a bunch of Legos, and then you stack all the Legos together, and that's your body of knowledge. Is that you find one Lego brick at a time, and then you click it together? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that's not a bad way. What they wanted to do, they rejected prior philosophical speculation, where you speculate about the nature of reality, and then you take your speculations and your theories, and then you go and investigate. And they said that you're already then conforming the reality to your priors, which we would say they did that as well. But
yeah. But it's just like you can't make an assumption and then try to prove the assumption. That's not fair. That's not logical. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a lot of deep stuff, especially early in the morning to my time as we're talking about that. So let's bring it back to Lutheranism. This is obviously important because whether people realize it or not, that debate, that development kind of shapes how the broader academic world views the entire world and really the existence of anything and everything. But why is German Theological Wissenschaft important to Lutheran history?
Interesting question. Maybe I first stumbled upon the topic of theology in Wissenschaft in maybe some of our readers have had a similar experience and they just forgot about it. It was in Dogmatics 1 at seminary, and we were reading Pieper in the first volume of Pieper's Dogmatics. And Pieper has a section there where he talks about, is theology a science? And at the time, as a first-year seminarian, I was just, what is he talking about? And again, I never thought about it until, years later. So perhaps, most of us would say, why is this an important question? Is it important? Is this just an artifact of Pieper and then what Pieper had studied in the 19th century before? But as you already kind of alluded to in your answer, it frames it frames the vision of reality, for lack of a better term, of where we live, of what reality is. But then when you move from Wissenschaft or science to theological Wissenschaft or theological science, it gets into the question of what theology is. The question of, is theology a science, and then demonstrating whether or not theology is a science, in many ways it's part of prolegomena and showing what theology is. But then there's also an external facing aspect where these 19th century theologians were attempting to demonstrate to their peers in the university that theology isn't just some kind of Sunday school endeavor, but that it is rigorous, it is academic, it is intellectual. And for us, confessional Lutherans, I would argue it's important because it's a central aspect to our 19th century heritage. Confessional Lutherans, especially from the German variety, I can't really speak to Scandinavians and others, but the German variety of 19th century confessional Lutherans, our origins really go back to what was going on in 19th century Germany. And often when we think of that history, we think of the Prussian Union, and we see how confessional Lutherans defined themselves over and against the Union, the Prussian Union, and other types of unions between the Reformed and Lutherans and the unionizing churches. And that's all true. But I would argue that just as important for these Lutherans in the middle part of the 19th century wasn't just defining themselves over and against what was going on in ecclesial formations and whether or not they were being forced to unite with the Reformed and unions or the rejection of that. But it was how theology was being conceived, taught, and conceived and taught in the university. And confessional Lutherans of all different stripes, if I can speak that way, had to engage the question of, is theology a science? And your whole entire theological endeavor and what you consider theology to be was in some way, I don't want to overstate it, but was contingent on how you answered that question.
Yeah, and I think just the academic world today, it owes a kind of a debt of gratitude to Lutheranism in general, because if we talk about sometimes like the golden age of Lutheran Orthodoxy, this is back in the 1600s and late 1500s. I wouldn't say that, don't want to dumb it down too much, but the smartest people in the world, the most literate, the most intellectual people in the world were probably mostly those Lutheran theologians who are saying, let's really study stuff to its highest degree. Let's really understand what the Bible says, and what can we learn from the Bible about the existence of God, and what does it mean about humanity and all that stuff. So the people who were digging the most into knowledge were very often, even in the Middle Ages, were connected to the church, and the Lutheran tradition had always been intellectual in the sense that it carried on the study of higher knowledge. And that's what I've seen. And that kind of means also that the German university system, and this is my impression, you tell me what you think, but wasn't the German university system in the 19th century really the most respected and cutting edge in the world at the time? I think that's assumed, right?
Yes, yes. That's the birth of the research university. And there's actually a great monograph put out by a German scholar by the name, whose name I forget right now. She looked at the relationship between the formation of some of the the most famous American universities, and how they modeled themselves after the form of the 19th century German research university. And even more but this isn't just a historical issue, like, all right, well, the formation of German universities and their relationship to American universities, all right, that was then, but what about now? The whole question of whether theology should be taught at a university, has a place at a university, aside from maybe a historical investigation, this is the same type of question, right? If theology has a place in a university, how does it justify its existence? How does it justify its place in an environment that is supposed to be dedicated to knowledge and the way we often think of what constitutes knowledge? So I think oftentimes we rest upon the work done by other people, and we don't investigate these questions or make them anew today.
Yeah, just kind of how do we justify it? How does it exist? And I think, not getting too far ahead into your research, but that's the issue, right? That Naturwissenschaft, kind of the empirical method, which, try to simplify it in my own words. Basically, if you can't see and experience for yourself, it isn't true, right? If you can't do tests and run a hypothesis and say, okay, this checks out, and it isn't true. And people were saying, well, you can't do that with God. You can't say, okay, God, if you're real, you need to zap my enemy with a lightning bolt right now. There isn't really a test to do, but that's really what philosophy had been about for, thousands of years. Is a lot of it's focused on just trying to prove the existence of God apart from the external written word, which we're going to have issue with saying, okay, that's kind of where you find him, but that Naturwissenschaft isn't going to accept the scriptures as evidence for God, or at least not in the same way that you and I will. But that being said, it's important for us to understand Lutheran history in the sense that in Germany, you got your Lutheran pastors from the universities. Mm-hmm. Today, I think most people in the United States are used to, okay, we have our own Lutheran colleges, they have their own pre-seminary programs, we have our own separate institutions that are Lutheran seminaries. But in a way, those are a result of this topic you're talking about, where, okay, we do have to separate theology from the mainstream university system, because in Germany, guys like Walther Winnekin and dozens of others were trained in a regular, standard German university where they were bumping shoulders with guys like Otto von Bismarck and all these countless famous scientists of the 19th century and philosophers. They were all going to the same institutions, but they ended up having very different conclusions about faith and where the world was. So I think that's maybe the last bit of context I want to impose on people today. But all these guys are going through the same system, coming from the same place, but that changed. So in your paper, you have a statement. You say the trajectory of theology in 19th century Germany cannot be understood apart from its relationship to Wissenschaft. Do you want to explain that a bit more, or do you think we've covered that?
Maybe just a little bit more. There's this great scholar of 19th century German theology and philosophy, Thomas Albert Howard, I think Albert is his middle name. And he makes the argument that as Germany at the 19th century was starting to become its own entity, right? Not just a gathering of territories, but you have the kind of origins of German nationalism beginning. And obviously, Germany won't become a nation state for quite a while later. But one of the markers by which Germany was beginning to differentiate itself against the French and others was its robust commitment to science, to Wissenschaft. And again, not Wissenschaft, science understood by nature, but by the whole accumulation by all knowledge. So my claim kind of goes back to Kant and his 1798 book, The Conflict of the Faculties. Therein, Kant really challenged and questioned whether theology stood the test of a rigorous academic discipline. And he said, no, it didn't. And this became a debate. And you mentioned earlier the kind of German research model. And that came out of the early part of the 19th century with the formation of the University of Berlin. And with the formation of the University of Berlin, Humboldt was asking various people to write essays about the formation of how this should be done. And there was a debate whether or not theology should even exist in the university. And representing kind of the side that says, no, theology has no place in the university is Fichte. But then the champion of theology in the university was Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher's position kind of won the day, and theology continued to exist within the university. But it only did so by having to conform itself to the current standards of whatever Wissenschaft understood itself to be, or, whatever others understood Wissenschaft to be. So theology got its foot in the door, but the cost of it was that theologians were constantly having to keep up with the Joneses, if you will. Theology was no longer its own entity. It was now being judged by an external criterion, namely science. And this set a trajectory for all of the 19th century where theology was continually kind of revitalizing itself and reforming itself. And so theology within the university in the 19th century can't be understood outside of these larger movements, discussions, debates about science, about Wissenschaft.
So you point out that an under-researched area of the 19th century theological Wissenschaft is the neo-Lutheran view, or the impact on that discussion. So in our podcast, this is the first time we get to really focus on someone primarily associated with the neo-Lutheran movement in the 19th century, although it's not what your paper was uncovering per se. Can you explain briefly for our audience, what does it mean to be a neo-Lutheran?
That's a good question, and it's a technical, hard question to answer. Already going back to the 1850s, 1860s, you had Germans writing these histories of 19th century Germany, and they observed a phenomena among Protestant Lutherans, and they didn't know how to identify them. They said that these Lutherans were intentionally Lutheran, self-consciously Lutheran. They rejected all attempts at union. Sometimes they seem to go even beyond Luther himself in this claim of some type of Lutheran identity. They flirted with certain aspects of Catholicism. And you have different terms that are used for them. You have neo-Lutheran, you have hyper-Lutheran. And I understand these terms. I use them in kind of an umbrella way. One could argue that a guy like Vilmar is quite different from, say, the Erlangen School of Theology, which he existed alongside of. And that's true. They're quite different. And then they're also quite different from, say, like the old Lutherans who rejected the Prussian Union, many of whom have a heritage that then leads to American Lutheran, confessional American Lutheranism. And that's true. And I don't want to brush over these differences. But in my usage, I use the term Neo-Lutheran in a very generic way to just group together, I guess, there's kind of those who rejected the Prussian Union and all attempts at union, those who had also then recovered the confessions and identified them not just as a historical text, not just as a legal text, but as a text that needed to be held to and confessed, and that was normative for theology. There's clearly going to be differences in how the confessions norm theology. But these neo-Lutherans, whether we're talking about Vilmar or Hoffman or Harless, or even you go north, Kleefoth and others, there is a unity by these two theological kind of principles, for lack of a better word.
So they were kind of men who went against the current, at least of the early to mid 19th century. They were very self-aware. We are Lutheran. We want to be Lutheran, and let's be really good at being Lutheran. Let's be intentional about it. Maybe is another way to put it, and distinct. And you said there's a very broad way that you're looking at it. But yeah, if you go to the different groups, you'll find what does that mean? What does that look like in practice? And you'll get different answers. And maybe that's where we can leave it for today,
yeah.
Maybe.
And one other thing I should say is they all really grew out of the awakening movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And that's even painting in a broad stroke to say that there was just an awakening movement, but you have these movements going on across the German territories where men and women are recovering the scriptures and recovering, in a sense, if you will, faith. And in some ways, the awakening movement was somewhat pietistic. But what you see going on as the awakening moves from the 1820s into the 1840s, it starts to become confessionally aligned. And you begin to have strong, strict Roman Catholics coming out of the awakening. And then this is in many ways where the neo-Lutherans come out of this movement. There's this great quote by Gottfried Thomasius, who talks about his own, if you will, I don't want to say conversion, but I use conversion in a non-technical sense, right? But his own kind of movement from rationalism to the awakening he says, we all of a sudden realized we were Lutheran. It's a great quote.
Yeah, and Walter Conser, in his book from a couple decades ago, he makes a connection between, you also have something else going on across the world. So that you have this awakening movement where, hey, we really believe, it's Jesus focused, which means we're scripture focused. And then surprise, surprise, we like the Lutheran confessions because they're so scripture focused. They give us, we believe this because, and then fill in the blank. But he makes that connection between the Romanticism movement because, 18th century, full of enlightenment, but it's very very rationalism focused, which is kind of this part of this Wissenschaft discussion too. But people, whether it's because of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and just kind of this bad taste in their mouth from a lot of negative stuff from really taking rationalism to its utmost degree, let's play it all the way through and see what happens. And they said, well, we didn't like that. They kind of viewed rationalism as cold, almost super intellectual, which is odd because they accused the Orthodox Lutherans of that. That was what the Pietists said. It's just very all mixed together. But yeah, Romanticism was, let's get in touch with our feelings, and a human being is more than just knowledge. And in some way, this cultural pushback against rationalism is kind of what made this faith movement possible, or maybe vice versa. It's really hard to figure that out. So
and German idealism was a reaction against German rationalism. And And this not only affected Protestants broadly and Lutherans, but also Roman Catholics. You had rationalistic Catholics. There was a Catholic Enlightenment, which is only now within the last, 10 years, really starting to be discovered. And there were Catholic priests and theologians who adopted Kant and sought to bridge Kant and Catholic theology. And there were great Catholic reforms rejecting the saints, rejecting pilgrimages, because they were anti-rational.
Oh, no, I'm not aware of that. I knew there was, in the Anglican Episcopalian Church and the Reformed Church, you see, there's all these parallel movements to what we see in Lutheranism. But yeah, I didn't know about the Catholic side too. So yeah, it is kind of a worldwide issue, but we see it played out here, focus on Lutheranism. So now can you tell us a bit, finally, about the guy we're supposed to be talking about today, August Vilmar? Who is he?
Yeah, Vilmar is an interesting figure. He was born in 1808 and then died in 1868. He was born in Hesse, which is kind of, I guess, central West Germany. And he studied theology at University of Marburg. And from there, he became a rector of a school. And then eventually he was promoted to be a director of a gymnasium. And actually, tying into our previous discussion, Vilmar was originally coming out of due to his university training in theology, he was a rationalist. He didn't believe in miracles. He wrote an early rationalistic theology systematic text, and he talks about he was glad that it didn't exist anymore. And I believe it was in this rationalistic dogmatic text he wrote, he denied belief in the Trinity. He said the Trinity is a superstitious belief. But then, through the course of his continued theological reading, Vilmar begins by the mid-1820s to undergo a slow theological transformation. Vilmar started to read Calvin and also Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher is interesting because I think a lot of us confessional Lutherans think of Schleiermacher as kind of a bad word. But for many, Schleiermacher was a quasi-hero. And then from there, he begins a study of early Christian fathers, which is this is a move that we see happen a lot with some of these neo-Lutherans. Schleiermacher leads to a study of the patristics, and Vilmar had read Augustine and Tertullian and Irenaeus, and he speaks about them. And then from there, he begins to read Luther and various fathers of Lutheran Orthodoxy. And this is all going on under a period of years. And then kind of, as Vilmar narrates his own transformation, two final pieces were pivotal for this turn that kind of leads him to this staunch confessional Lutheran, which is what he's known for. And that is this book called The Doctrine of Sin and the Propitiator by a German theologian by the name of Friedrich August Tollach. Tollach is, again, one of these names, whether it's with Vilmar or others, who is very influential coming out of this awakening movement. And then finally, Vilmar returning to the Confessions and reading the Augustana. And all of a sudden therein, it's, Vilmar talks about kind of like the lights coming on, and he sees everything together. And he says, by kind of 1830, his transformation from rationalism to a kind of robust Lutheranism, maybe what we would call confessional Lutheranism, had happened. Eventually, in the Territorial Church of Hesse, Vilmar, as rector of a gymnasium, was also working for the superintendent of the Territorial Church. And eventually, by 1855, Vilmar was elected to be the general superintendent, which is kind of like a Lutheran bishop, sans episcopal succession and all that kind of stuff. But his election displeased the prince, who then refused to confirm this election. And to then get rid of Vilmar, he appoints him to be a professor of theology at the University of Marburg. And this is where Vilmar then spends the rest of his life, is teaching theology at University of Marburg, even though he didn't have what we would call a doctorate of theology. So this is how he kind of weaseled his way into the university.
All right. Well, that's who he is. And you focused in on one particular writing that has to deal with this Wissenschaft topic, Die Theologie der Tatsachen wider die Theologie der Rhetorik. But I don't know if I said rhetoric correctly in German. I just said it in English. But anyways, the theology of facts against or in opposition of the theology of rhetoric would be my translation of the title. Why did he write this? What were its major points?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Now, this is probably his most well-known work, and it's a really slim little volume. It's not a detailed dogmatic text. It's not a church history text. In many ways, it's just this kind of brief sketch of theology. But that's exactly what it is. Vilmar pens this work upon his appointment to the university as a professor of theology. And I think, if we just read this book, you're like, all right, what is this? But when we contextualize it within 19th century German university context, it was not uncommon. In fact, it was common when someone became a professor of theology for them to give a opening lecture, which was often a book, which then detailed their understanding of theology, or their understanding of church history, or their understanding of whatever it is that they were going to give. And that's how I interpret this book. And that's what I believe that Vilmar is doing here. This is his kind of, if you will, programmatic essay about theology. But what Vilmar does in it isn't just present his confession of theology, but he does that primarily through a foil. And his foil is modern German theology. And he does this really he paints in very broad strokes here. He doesn't have a detailed analysis of the major figures of German theology of his day. He doesn't articulate, this is where Schleiermacher's wrong, this is where whomever is wrong. He just paints in broad strokes. And in many ways, it's a harangue against what German theology is and what he says is the failure of German theology. And he speaks to this as one who has come out of German theology and who has seen the havoc that modern contemporary German theology is playing out in the churches of Germany. And then he calls them the theologians of rhetoric. And he doesn't mean rhetoric here in the technical sense of the study of rhetoric or anything like that, but rather these theologians are just playing with words. There's no substance to their theology. There's no vitality to their theology. These theologians have divorced themselves from the heart, the essence, the source of what theology is. And all they do is word play. And against that, he then presents his theology, which he calls the theology of Tatsachen, or the theology of facts. And then in this work, he talks about science, theology as science. Then he goes into exegesis, systematic theology, what is the church, what are the sacraments, confession, church discipline, the office of the ministry, homiletics, pastoral theology. Yet, that's a number of different subjects. All of those he treats very briefly. And he always kind of says, this is how they are misunderstood, and here's what they truly are, but in again, just in a brief manner.
So he kind of kicks down the door and takes the bull by the horns. Basically, he's basically saying, everyone else, you are wrong. Which I don't, to be an original thinker, to be a professor, you got to disagree with someone, or else you're just a yes man. But that's probably unusual, right? To say this whole system, the entire way everyone is approaching it, is just messed up. So that's a pretty big deal, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty. It takes some fortitude and courage, and perhaps an indifference to what your peers will think. Yeah.
I think Lutherans like to see that in another Lutheran because it reminds them of Luther himself. And I think that's probably, I think that's why Walther remains a very popular figure, because he kind of had that same attitude, and those kinds of guys just kind of stand out. So yeah, that makes him very, very interesting and somewhat appealing, I think, to us today. So in this document, you discussed how he is kind of trying to do a 180 and do a pushback and everything. What in his mind were some of the dangers of kind of reframing theology in the same form, in the same manner as natural science studies?
Great question. This is really, I think, the way into this text. I first read this in an English translation when it came out, I think back in 2008, 2009. And I was a seminarian then, and I enjoyed it. And I think, I made sense of it. But I guess this is true for all works, right? When you understand them within the context in which they're written, then they make more sense. And when you understand what's going on in the German theological landscape in this milieu, it makes much more sense. Vilmar really focuses, I believe, on one particular aspect of this understanding of Wissenschaft, which has permeated theology, and specifically not the idealistic understanding that we outlined earlier, but the second model, theology as kind of an Wissenschaft, science driven as an empirical study. That is the idea popularized by one D.F. Strauss, David Friedrich Strauss, and his monumental work, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, where Strauss mocked theologians for their faith. And he said, theologians are not able to engage in theology because their vision is blinded. Faith corrupts their ability to actually do the work of theology. And Strauss says, I have removed from myself all theological presuppositions. In other words, I've removed from myself faith. I do not engage in the task of theology from the position of faith. Therefore, I am able to be a true theologian. And that, while that is highly contested and it shakes the theological world of 19th century Germany, it does become an idea that is lasting, that one has to have this kind of presuppositionless take to do theology. And that is what Vilmar rejects root and stem. This idea that someone can call themselves a theologian, someone can study the scriptures, someone can train men for the office of the ministry and not have faith. And in fact, think that allows them to be a true theologian.
Like you have to be more or less you start off as an atheist to be a theologian. That's your starting point. Yeah. Pretty perverted, but yeah. So on the other hand, how did he view the purpose of theological study? I think you kind of alluded to it with his reason for objecting to it.
Vilmar did not see theology in the university, or theology at all, as intended for, maybe this was to go back to the first part of our conversation. The other thing that's going on at this time, university studies are no longer simply for training men for a practical purpose. Medicine, law, and theology, right, were the original kind of branches of the university, and they were all practically oriented. Now, university disciplines are to engage in research, and they are to promote the discipline by breaking new grounds in research. So Vilmar sees this as dead. Theology is not about research. Theology is not about coming up with novel theories and discovering new things. For Vilmar, theology is all oriented to training men for the pastoral office in order to then lead the Church of Christ, to preach, to teach, to administer the sacraments to Christ's sheep. Theology, for Vilmar, to sound, a bit cliche, is fundamentally practical in that it always ends in lived life, in the congregation, in the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. And he says that's not what's going on in theological studies in 19th century Germany. If that's going on, it's secondary to the task of training men to be scholars and to engage in research.
I've in my own research, I've noticed Edward Robinson, I think was his name, and he taught theology in New England in the 1800s, but he went to the University of Halle for a while, 1820s, 1830s. And as an American person, he's saying, oh, they're all very smart here, but it just shocked him that for the examination of pastors, there's nothing about what do you actually believe. It's just what do you know and what can you prove that you know. And he just thought that was, in preparing pastors, there was no actual discussion of faith itself. It was just the knowledge. And it seems like, Vilmar here would agree with that American observer, or that's totally backwards. So how was this received, this Theologie der Tatsachen, by his peers, by the broader world?
I've only looked at this a little bit, so I can't speak too broadly, but I can't speak, with too much precision. But broadly speaking, there's kind of two audiences, or there's two reactions. His students love him. Vilmar creates within Marburg a following of students and pastors who adore him. And that already existed even prior to his professorship. When you look at the numbers he received when he was elected to the general superintendent office, we see this in the fact that almost all of the works that we have from Vilmar were published posthumously as a sign of love and dedication by his former students. But within the world of the university itself, and other universities within this 19th century German context, Vilmar was kind of laughed at. He was seen as a joke. He was also seen as a troubler, someone who was, for lack of a better word, a bull in a china shop. He was not respected, and he was seen as kind of a persona non grata.
Which I guess makes sense if he's saying, "Hey, I'm new here, and you're all stupid, basically. you're all not doing your job right." Yeah, it's hard to win friends that way, even if things need to be said. And although you don't cover it in your paper, in your article, just because I'm biased, I live in America, as do most of our listeners at this point. Do you have any insights on how Vilmar's approach has impacted Lutheranism in America? Is that something you've run across?
I can't speak to whether or not it has directly impacted Lutheranism in America. When you look at someone like Pieper, whenever Pieper talks about Vilmar, he doesn't really speak glowingly about Vilmar. Vilmar is one of these Lutherans that Pieper would lambast as being Catholic-leaning, specifically because of Vilmar's understanding of the office of the ministry and things like that. And whether that's a fair representation of Vilmar, that's another issue. But I think, at least, I'm not so familiar with some of the other branches of confessional Lutheranism within North America outside of the Missouri Synod. But within the Missouri Synod, again, while Vilmar did not, I think, directly impact these figures and the way that theology was conceived of, at least in its infancy and its early years, theology was primarily seen as a practical, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but as in a practical matter, right? That is training men to be parish pastors. That theology is not so much an intellectual pursuit as it is a study of the living God, the living Word of God, and the justifying God, right? In this concept. So I think you can see a parity between that in the Missouri Synod, at least in the first few generations, and Vilmar. One could see perhaps a change in the Missouri Synod when you get into the 20th century and a different understanding of theology, but that's another topic.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts, especially sharing the content of your research, just kind of the tip of the iceberg of broader research that you've done, but I think it exemplifies this very significant shift and the reactions to it in the subject of Wissenschaft. So briefly, for the few minutes we have left in our time today, could you tell us a bit about your research process? How did you go about writing on this topic? What was your research method like?
I had spent a lot of time reading and contextualizing 19th century German thought, both philosophically and theologically, reading a lot of Kant, Schelling, Fichte, Schleiermacher, a little bit of F.C. Bauer and the Tübingen School and stuff like that. And then even before I had moved to Vilmar, I had already looked at one of his, I guess we would call contemporaries, Adolf Harless. And that provided me a pretty good understanding of at least the theological landscape wherein Vilmar was working. And so by the time I turned to this work from Vilmar, I was able to situate this work and unpack it and read it and make a lot of connections that I think would be absent if you just read the work. So I guess the standard answer is, I read it in a historical contextual, through a historical contextual lens.
So were there any challenges that got in your way as you were conducting your research on this topic?
Yeah, I primarily did it, or exclusively did it, within the United States. So there's not a lot of work on Vilmar. There are some good articles, but they're all a bit dated. There are a number of doctoral dissertations, very few, I should say, on Vilmar. So there's not a lot of work that I was able to draw upon. And by being kind of grounded in the United States, was not able to do any deep archival work or anything like that. So there were not a lot of other milestone works that I could use to further unpack, at least within Vilmar's own writings.
So I guess, in other words, you were relying on largely his published works. Would that be a fair way to?
Very much so. And within my larger work on Vilmar, I looked at some of his other popular works, his dogmatics. I looked at a series of school lectures he had, and those were very helpful. And some other smaller works. But this, by far, is probably his most famous work, his dogmatics, and then his pastoral theology. And I examined kind of all of those.
So finally, on this topic, do you have any unanswered questions about Vilmar in this Wissenschaft?
Yeah, what I wish I could have done to actually circles back to a question you asked, not just look at the reception of this work, but what happened to the theological posture that Vilmar represented within the university. In some ways, you can see aspects of it taken up in a figure kind of like Karl Barth, right? And Barth, who rejected and reacted against his liberal German training, right? Who also then embraced theology as the speaking of the living God. And I'm not saying Barth and Vilmar are similar, but you see some similarities. But I wish I could have done some more work on what happened immediately following Vilmar.
Yeah, was he kind of like the dying gasp in the German university system, trying to take that viewpoint? And was he, was there no no real torch bearer to carry it on directly from him? Maybe
pre-Bismarck, there was this fear that these confessional Lutherans were going to run the table. You see that, Schleiermacher was afraid of this. Obviously, he died earlier, but other theologians were afraid that there was this conservative reaction, both politically and theologically, in the 40s. And then by the end of the 50s into the 60s, that was all dead. This kind of confessional return, conservative return on a broad scale had ended. And these guys just became minor figures, they were no longer the big players on the stage anymore. They were just a kind of a flash in the pan.
Yeah. So do you think there are any more areas for potential research on this topic?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In my work, I looked at 3 figures of Neo-Lutheran understanding of Wissenschaft. And I wish I would have had more time to investigate this, specifically with some other figures that were perhaps more similar to Vilmar's own, like Theodor Clifford up in Mecklenburg, and some of the more confessional figures that were teaching up at the University of Rostock. And I also would have liked to have seen what happened in the second generation of these neo-Lutherans, and how did they carry on the legacy of these kind of first figures. I'd like to look into that.
So are you working on anything right now, or do you have any upcoming Lutheran history projects that you're focused on?
I'm continuing to work in this period of 19th century Neo-Lutheran history. Now my topic is a topic that probably most confessional Lutherans don't think about much, and it's the idea of the development of dogma and the development of doctrine, and then the history, the Dogmengeschichte and Dogmaentwicklung. This is probably, for those of us familiar with 19th century theology, we think of someone maybe like John Henry Newman and his famous essay on development. But the development of dogma was a very important theme within 19th century German history, in figures like Schleiermacher and F.C. Bauer. But then even when you turn to these Neo-Lutherans, they were writing some of the monographs on it, others shorter essays, but they all kind of believed that there was some kind of doctrinal development. And so right now I'm looking at Wilhelm Lehr and his understanding of development, and I hope to then turn that into a larger project where I examine these 19th century figures. And from the perspective of Missouri, when you look at Walther just flat out rejects, denies the idea of doctrinal development. He says there is no doctrinal development. Pieper carries that forward as well. And I understand the reasons why they take. And I want to see how these 19th century, how their contemporaries across the Atlantic, why they didn't take the position that Walther took and just dismissed it. But in fact, they articulated very complex, in some ways, understandings of doctrinal development.
Well, interesting. Yeah, that definitely is relevant in more than one way. Well, and then finally, for a broader last question here, what would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history in general?
To kind of be a homer for my own area of research, I wish someone could do a more comprehensive history of Neo-Lutheranism coming out of the Awakening movement and then cresting, let's just say, at the end of the 19th century. we know bits and pieces of that history, and there have been various monographs that looks at it from the Bavarian Lutherans and others, and then how kind of the rise of Bismarck and the Prussian machine and all that kind of that wreaked havoc. But I just don't. I've not encountered a real good comprehensive history of this movement.
Right. Well, that's a very specific request for someone. If they're looking for a topic, you'll find at least 2 dedicated readers for that. So, all right. Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Lee, and for sharing this very important discussion with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.